I spent the last 8 years trying to find the real-life Limitless pill after destroying my brain in my 20s. The only thing that actually moved the needle wasn't from American Lab, prescription pad, or any supplement company. It was 5 peptides sitting in decades of Russian clinical research that nobody in the West wants to talk about. The average American's attention span is now shorter than a goldfish. And every single year, we are measurably getting worse at thinking, focusing, and retaining information. And the solution that Big Pharma keeps handing to 16 million Americans every single day is a drug that was developed from the same chemical family as methamphetamine. Adderall. It works, but at what cost? Because it floods your brain with dopamine, it forces focus, and the moment you stop taking it, your brain has forgotten how to produce that dopamine on its own. Now, what if there's a better answer? Because after spending my 20s blasting steroids, Adderall, Coke, and alcohol, my body and my brain was absolutely fried by the time I was 30. So I was willing to experiment with anything to fix my brain and operate at full speed again. In this video, I'm gonna break down what these 5 brain peptides are, how effective each one has been in my experiments, and what I would do differently if I were starting today. Which brings us to the most effective one on this list. Limitless peptide number 1, Epithalon. Most people chasing cognitive performance are asking, how do I get more out of my brain? But the question you should be really asking is, first, what's actually quietly destroying my brain ceiling in the first place? Every cell in your body contains chromosomes. At the end of every chromosome is a protective cap called a telomere, and it's there to stop the chromosome from degrading. Now, every time your cells divide, those telomere caps get shorter, and once they're gone, the cell stops functioning properly, either dies or it becomes what scientists call a zombie cell that no longer works but refuses to die and actively inflames the tissue around it. That process is what we call biological aging. Chronic stress, poor sleep, stimulant use, alcohol, all of it accelerates this process. By the time that most guys hit their late 30s, their cellular age is running years ahead of their chronological age. It'd be an interesting coincidence if the same pharmaceutical company selling stimulants to 16 million Americans had no financial incentive to tell you that those stimulants were accelerating the very cognitive decline they were supposed to fix. But I don't know for sure, but it's worth keeping in mind. So what's the solution to reversing cellular aging and the telomere degrading that's been quietly shrinking your cognitive ceiling since you were 30? And that's where Epithalon comes in. It's a synthetic tetrapeptide, which means 4 amino acids. Now, it's derived from a natural occurring substance in the pineal gland. Its entire job is to rebuild those telomere caps and reverse the shortening. Soviet scientists spent over 40 years studying basically whether or not you could use pharmacology to reactivate this. What they found was Epithalon. Now, in over 4 decades of research has been shown to extend the telomere length and also directly stimulate the pineal gland. It's responsible for the melatonin production, the circadian rhythm, and also what researchers now believe plays a significant role in the brain's nightly restoration cycle, aka the reason you can sleep 8 hours and still wake up feeling like you got 2 to 4. Epithalon is not a focused compound or a stimulant, which is the whole point, because stimulants aren't going to fix any cellular degrading. They just make you feel like they do until they don't work anymore. And Epithalon is the only compound that I found that actually addresses what's breaking down underneath everything else. I ran my first Epithalon cycle at 1 milligram daily for 20 days. What I expected was some kind of noticeable cognitive shift, or maybe sharper thinking, better recall, something I could actually point to and say, oh, that's Epithalon. That's not what happened. What happened was this: my sleep changed. Within the first week, I was getting into deeper sleep faster. My dreams became more vivid, which sounds like a minor thing until you actually understand that vivid dreaming is a huge marker for REM quality. And REM is basically when your brain is going to consolidate your memory and it clears all that metabolic waste through your lymphatic system. I was waking up actually restored and energized for the first time in years. The cognitive effect was more like the absence of a persistent, low-grade fog I had normalized so completely that I stopped noticing it was even there. What I can tell you is this: that my first Epithalon cycle produced a noticeable raise in my baseline for cognitive function that I had not experienced from any other single compound. And I've tried pretty much everything you can imagine. So before we get into how I ran Epithalon, it's very important to note that I'm not a doctor and nothing in this video constitutes medical advice. What I share is my personal experiment, the data that I've seen, and I'm sharing it with you for educational purposes only. So if I were starting my research from scratch, this is exactly how I would structure my first Epithalon experiment. I would start at 5 milligrams subcutaneous injection daily for 20 consecutive days. Now, I would time this in the evening, very important, 30 to 60 minutes before bed, because that aligns with your pineal gland's natural activation window, and you want Epithalon working with your circadian rhythm, not against it. That's one cycle. I would run it twice a year, maybe once in the fall, once in the spring. Now, if you want to be more conservative on your first run, you could start with 2 to 3 milligrams daily and work up from there. What I do not do is run it continuously. Epithalon is not a daily driver. Do not do that. It is a reset. So short cycles, twice a year, and let your biology do what it's supposed to do. Now, this is the foundation of everything that follows in this video. And that pineal gland restoration Epithalon initiates is exactly where this next compound is going to pick up. Limitless peptide number 2, Pinealon. Now, this is the most underrated compound on this entire list. You will not find Pinealon in mainstream content. Most people who have been experimenting with peptides for years have never even heard of it. That's exactly why I have it here. Pinealon is a tripeptide, so 3 amino acids, also developed by the same Soviet research who gave us Epithalon, but they do 2 different things. Now, Pinealon works directly on the brain cells themselves, so think of it like this. You have the cleanup crew that comes in after the work is actually done. Every stressor you run through your body, which is the hard training, the poor sleep, stimulants, high cortisol, alcohol, recreational drugs, all generate something called oxidative damage inside your brain tissue. Think of it like rust forming on metal, except the metal is your neurons and the rust never stops accumulating unless you actively do something about it to stop it. Now, over time, it slows down the neurons responsible for memory and recall, and it disrupts your brain's internal clock, which is the signaling system that tells it when to repair, when to consolidate information, and when to focus or perform. You feel this very gradually, which starts with lower thinking ability, and you find it very hard to get into a flow state and focus. And sleep, it doesn't feel like you're restoring anything even when you get 8 to 10 hours. What Pinealon does is reduce that oxidative stress in the brain tissue, and you're gonna protect the neurons from further degrading and restore your circadian rhythm, which your brain needs to actually recover overnight. Now, in Russia, it is completely legal and classified as a peptide, or they call it a bioregulator or nootropic, rather than a demonized substance like what most peptides are here in the Western culture. So here's what I personally noticed after using Pinealon for the first few times. Basically, Pinealon will frustrate you if you go in expecting to feel something immediately. The first cycle I ran, I generally wasn't sure if it was working, and I almost cut the cycle short. Now, what changed my mind was looking at my sleep data after. My deep sleep was measurably going up. My HRV was way more stable, and the 2 p.m. cognitive wall that I would hit, I just accepted as part of my day, and it was consistently gone across the whole cycle. It was more like a very quiet, steady improvement that only showed up when I looked at the actual data. Don't judge this one on day 5. The people who dismiss Pinealon and ran it for a week waiting for a stimulant hit and felt nothing is not what this compound does. And the way I would personally structure a cycle if I were experimenting with Pinealon would be basically starting with 200 micrograms sub-Q injection daily for 20 consecutive days. I would time in the evening, the same window around Epithalon if I'm running them together, because both compounds work with your circadian rhythm. And evening dosing is when that signaling is most active. I run it 2 to 3 times per year. That's it. If you're running alongside Epithalon, space the injections about 15 to 30 minutes apart. Epithalon is restoring the foundation at your cell level, while Pinealon is protecting the brain tissue sitting on top of that foundation. You run them together, this is the full foundation protocol before you introduce anything else. You could run this alongside or right after Epithalon. Together they form the protective foundation the next 3 compounds are built on. Which brings us to the next Limitless stack on this list. Limitless peptides number 3 and 4. You have Semax and Selank. Every supplement stack that focuses on hacking your productivity level works on top of whatever neurological baseline you already have. They stimulate and force the output from the system that exists, and none of them actually build you a new system. That's the problem with stimulants and traditional ADHD meds. And it's why most people cycling through them feel diminishing returns within weeks. But what if the answer wasn't pushing harder, but actually expanding the infrastructure itself? Well, that's what Semax does. And does it through a molecule in your brain, also known as BDNF. Basically, it means brain-derived neurotrophic factor. BDNF is essentially your fertilizer for your brain. It drives neuroplasticity, which is basically the brain's ability to form new connections, encode new information, and rewire itself in response to the experience. The higher your BDNF, the faster you learn, the better you retain information, and the more efficient your brain adapts under pressure. Cool, right? BDNF slowly declines with age though, but you can raise or slow down the decline with exercise, fasting, even cold exposure. Now these work, but they're very, very, very slow. We're talking weeks to months of consistent effort to move the needle just a little bit. But if you're watching this channel, chances are you've already been doing that stuff. Semax raises the BDNF within hours. Now it's developed in Russia in the 1980s, has been prescribed clinically there for stroke recovery, cognitive decline, and some neuro rehab for decades. It's one of the most researched nootropic peptides in existence, with a safety profile built on 40 plus years of clinical trials and use. The mechanism goes way beyond BDNF alone. Semax also increases dopamine and serotonin activity in the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of your brain that's responsible for executing the function and decision making and also memory. It does this without the receptor downregulation that comes with the stimulants. Now, meaning the effect doesn't require escalating doses to maintain the same effects. The first thing I noticed with Semax was the verbal fluency. So my cadence was very good. My thoughts were coming faster and I was more organized. And the feeling of having the right word immediately rather than reaching or thinking for it, man, that sounds like a small thing, but it's huge. For anyone that communicates for a living, leading teams, coaching, selling, creating content, it is not a small thing. If you know, you know. The second thing I noticed was my learning speed. I was moving through information faster and retaining more of it. Now, what I want to be straight about is I did not experience anything resembling a stimulant effect. The effect is more like your brain is running at a higher gear that feels completely natural rather than being forced. But the problem is a higher gear means nothing if there's friction in your system consuming the output before it actually reaches you. And that's what Selank does and why it's usually stacked along with Semax. It solves the interference problem. It is a synthetic peptide derived from natural occurring immune peptide called tufsin. It modulates the GABA system. It's the same system the benzos and the alcohol work on, but without sedating you or developing a tolerance or dependency that those produce. It also upregulates the BDNF, which increases serotonin metabolism and stabilizes the brain's peptides that your brain uses to regulate stress response at a neurochemical level. Now, in simple terms, it reduces anxiety without touching your sharpness. Your cognitive horsepower stays completely intact. And the mainstream gives you two options for anxiety or ADHD. Either sedatives that make you calm and slow, or stimulants that suppress the feeling of anxiety while making the underlying stress response even worse. Selank is neither. And for the first time I used Selank, I sat down to work and the work just happened. I didn't feel any friction or background noise pulling my focus in 3, 4, 5, 10 different directions. What I want to be honest about though is Selank did not eliminate stress. High pressure situations are still registered as high pressure. What changed was how long the stress stuck around. The way stress used to linger for hours after the event was gone, and that shortened a lot. And here's the thing about running Semax and Selank together. Semax expands the cognitive infrastructure and Selank removes the interference that was preventing you from accessing that. And that is what I would start with before ever considering anything higher. 1 to 2 drops per nostril. My head was tilted slightly back and I let it absorb rather than drain into my throat. I run it for about 2 to 4 weeks, then take 2 to 4 weeks off. The reason for that cycle is because the BDNF signaling does not benefit from continuous stimulation over and over. You want to trigger the upregulation, let your neuroplasticity develop, then let the system stabilize and normalize. Then you could do your next run. What I do not do is push to higher doses, chasing that effect. And the way I would run Selank is 300 micrograms intranasally, split across the morning and early afternoon doses basically for 14 days. I would do 150 micrograms in the morning and 150 micrograms midday. The split dosing matters because Selank's half-life is short when you use a nasal spray, and you want that GABA modulation present during your most active cognitive window, not just the first 2 hours of your day. I would avoid late evening doses because some people definitely get a mild stimulating effect from the Selank. That could definitely interrupt your sleep if you dose it too close to bed. The same cycle structure as Semax, so 2 to 4 weeks on, 2 to 4 weeks off. And that's one of the things that the clinical research is very, very clear on. You could cycle this compound cleanly. And if you're running them together, I would dose Semax first thing in the morning and Selank 15 to 20 minutes later. The reason for that separation is that you want to assess each compound's effect individually before layering them in. Once you know how your system responds to each one, the stack becomes very predictable. Now in the afternoon, I'm going to take my second dose of Selank around 1, 2, 3 p.m. I do not redose the Semax in the afternoon. One Semax dose in the morning is enough to drive the BDNF elevation levels up for the full day. More does not mean better. The stack runs on the same 14-day cycle, both compounds on, both compounds off at the same time. Now we covered the foundation, we covered the protection, the clarity, and the neuroplasticity environment. Everything up to this point has context for what comes next, because the last and most powerful brain compound on this list is Dihexa, which was actually developed in Washington State University. Now let me give you a number, 10 million. That is how many times more potent Dihexa is compared to the BDNF itself at driving the formation of new synaptic connections in the brain. Not 10, not 100, not 1,000, not 10,000, 10 million times. That figure comes from some good research out of Washington State University where Dihexa was actually developed. Every other compound on this list, by the way, works with existing neuro infrastructure. Dihexa physically grows new synaptic connections, and it works by potentiating something called the HGF receptor. It's a growth factor, and this signaling pathway is one of the biggest drivers for something called synaptogenesis in the brain. This is the process at which neurons form new connections with each other. So more connections means faster processing, better ability to remember things, and you're much quicker and sharper. Dihexa drives the formation of those connections at a level that nothing else comes even close to it, which is why it was originally aimed at people with Alzheimer's. The goal was to find something that could actually reverse this synaptic loss that was driving this cognitive decline in people with neuro disease. What they found worked so well that it immediately drew tons of attention from a cognitive enhancement research community. Never made it to the mainstream medical practice, surprising, and no pharmaceutical company has ever had any incentive to run trials that are needed for the approval. Because a peptide that grows new neuron connections at 10 million times of the brain's power somehow never made it to your doctor's office. Weird. I'll let you think about why that might happen, but the first effect is this enhanced pattern of recognition. Because your synaptogenesis mechanism means more connections forming between existing neurons, and more connections mean your brain can surface relationships between pieces of information way faster. The problems that would normally require a lot of thinking become very fast. The second thing that significantly improved was your ability to retain information, which is huge, because Dihexa drives the formation of those connections basically during a time of learning and doing research. The third thing is your processing speed, meaning that your brain finds faster solutions because it has more roads to basically route through. The fourth is what researchers describe as the executive function improvement. Now, this is basically the ability to hold multiple complex ideas simultaneously, integrate them, and act on them. This is the mechanism behind what the Washington State team was observing in their Alzheimer's research. And what's important to understand about all four of these effects, that they are not acute, they are not a stimulant response that peaks and crashes, because synaptogenesis is a structural change, and new connections that Dihexa drives the formation of do not disappear when the compound clears your system or you stop it. This is fundamentally a different category of cognitive intervention than anything else that's available on the market. The way Dihexa is researched typically goes like this. You start at 5 milligrams orally once a day in the morning for 14 days. Dihexa is one of the peptides actually confirmed orally active and crosses the blood-brain barrier without injection. They do make creams, but I prefer the oral form. Morning timing is definitely deliberate because you want that activity happening when you're most active, and you want that cognitive window during the learning and during the work hours and during the hours when your brain is actually encoding new information. That is when the new synaptic connections are going to form most efficiently. Here's the thing about Dihexa that most people are gonna miss. The half-life on this compound is about 12 days. That means the effects do not disappear when the compound clears your system on day 15. The synaptic connections it drives the formation of are structural, so they don't vanish into thin air. This is why I do not run Dihexa continuously, and I would definitely not recommend it. 14-day cycle, you're gonna assess it properly, is definitely very impactful, and I would take a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks off after that. I also run Dihexa after the foundation is in place, not a standalone, because the Epithalon and the Pinealon and the Semax, the Selank, they all come first. That's building a neurological environment that's been prepared for Dihexa. Then when Dihexa comes in, the synaptogenesis it drives happens in an optimized system, not in a depleted, dysfunctional one. The sequence matters as much as the compounds themselves. That's the difference between experimenting intelligently and just taking random shit. So there you have it, the 5 most powerful cognitive peptides in 2026. The ones I personally experimented with to restore my cognitive function after recklessly destroying my brain in my 20s. Now, if you're a high-performing man in your 30s, 40s, or 50s, and you want a personalized biohacking protocol built around your specific blood work, your hormone levels, and your exact starting point, just click the first link in the description and book a call with my team and see how we can potentially help you take your performance and physique to the next level using real biohacking protocols. If you got value from this video, hit subscribe, drop a comment below, and tell me which compound in this list are you most interested in running first. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.